I'm joined by Alexandra Smart this morning, and I'm delighted to have this conversation with her. Alexandra has a breadth of experience across media, digital. She's also widely known for having founded and developed over, 2 decades, the Ginger and Smart women's fashion label and brand. And I'm sure she'll refer to some of that in our conversation today. Today she's an advisor, she's a non-executive director across a number of boards and is still actively involved in the fashion industry. And she's an outstanding executive coach, and I'm delighted that Alex is joining us this morning for this conversation. We're going to explore the whole idea of creativity, which is, I know, very much your space, your wheelhouse, but also thinking about how organizations can use creativity as a superpower, regardless of whether they're a government body, a law firm, engineering, or what have you. So how we apply this more broadly. So we should start, though, by defining what we mean by creativity, because a lot of people like me, when I think about it, I think about, hang on, is this paintbrushes and fashion and fabrics? And so as you think about creativity in organizations, what goes through your mind?
Well, I think it's a really important definition, because creativity to different organizations and industry sectors means different things. But from a broad perspective, it's about innovation, originality. It's about creation of ideas or products or services. It's a different outside of the box way of thinking. And when you employ that as a tool within an organization, married with commerciality, which we all know is about business, the spirit of business, processes, people, it's about getting business done. When you marry the creativity as just defined with commerciality, there's an intersection, and what I call the magic, where you really add value, where you can really change the dial within an organisation if you respect and celebrate creativity as much as you do commerciality. But it's a tough tightrope.
You won't be surprised to know that I probably wasn't in your target market of consumers back in your Ginger and Smart days. And I don't know, of course, what it was like for you, but I'm interested to know, because I'm guessing, though, that women's fashion particularly, that whole journey as you developed that business and then sold it ultimately successfully to private equity and the like, was a story that was about this tension between on one hand being creative, but on the other hand the commerciality, because I can only imagine how fiercely competitive and fickle women's fashion is, and to trade successfully for 20 years, and how did you use creativity to create clearly super successful commercial outcomes?
Well, I think fashion's a great example, and any creative industries really, of creativity. It's a great case study of creativity and commerciality, because you can design the most beautiful dresses in the world, but if you don't have a market and a consumer prepared to pay for them, then it's all over anyway. So the tightrope within the fashion industry is not to lean too far into creativity and then go down a rabbit hole of where you think a customer wants to spend their money, versus spending your time in the commercial side looking at spreadsheets and data and sell-throughs, and forgetting the importance of creativity. And creativity in fashion is really understanding what the customer, in our case women, want before they really want it. So there's a lot of psychology in that. There's a lot of outside of the square thinking. There's a lot of testing to make sure that your creative juices and your creative ideas are actually going to wash in the real commercial world. So that tightrope that I'm talking about is something that you've got to really be thinking about every day, and making sure that you're reining in too far to the left and not ending up too far to the right. And the success factor is maintaining that tightrope.
So is creativity almost code word for disruption?
Yeah.
Using creativity to disrupt and to constantly evolve? Is that the way you think of it?
Well, yeah, one of the ways of thinking about it. I think that it's about disruption, it's about being open to different ideas, it's about trusting, the creative process, creative people, in order to develop those sorts of ideas. It's about building entrepreneurial thinking into organisations, because that's another way of describing creativity, in order for there to be, these moments where you create something really different that then can be embedded through the commercial side of the business. So yes, disruption's a great way of describing it. I mean, we know that, or evidence shows that up to 64% of leaders are very rusted onto their way of thinking, rusted onto their decision-making process. So this creative disruption, if you like, way of thinking helps leaders to change their framework, change their ideas, change their way of making decisions in the commercial side as well. So that disruptive power or energy in creativity is essentially very important across all levels of business.
So let me understand this correctly. So what you're saying is that 64% of managers and leaders have this strong habit to make their decisions and operate in a particular fashion, right? So that means then to be open to disruption, to be open to creativity, are we then really only appealing to the 30-odd% at that point, or is there, what about the majority here? How do we help them?
Well, good point. I mean, I think the point about creativity and commercial thinking practices is around collaboration. So first of all, you've got to celebrate creativity and commerciality in equal doses, whatever industry that might be in. Creative industries, it's veering further over here. Perhaps legal firms and government departments, we're leaning further over here. So whatever that tightrope is and wherever it sits on the continuum is an important thing to recognise and have awareness of within an organisation. And then, the creative thinking expresses itself in making sure that the culture, the underlying culture of the organisation celebrates both ways of thinking and has both people in the room, in meetings, in decision-making processes. You've got people with the creative ideas, and then the commercial creative ideas might be product developers, commercial realities, risk and finance departments, having them both in the room with a trusting environment and culture where those conversations can spark and move decision-making down the track.
Isn't that also, though, a potential recipe for disaster? You've got two sorts of functions and mindsets and ways of seeing the world that are just perhaps quite opposite to each other.
Well, creativity is messy. Organisations need to be prepared to get uncomfortable with decision-making processes and ideas and how that marries into commercial reality. So yes, it's not linear, and organisations need to be open to that. Leaders need to be open to that. Yeah, like families. It's not easy and it's not linear and it's not, everyone doesn't have the answers, but out of that comes better thinking, better ideas, value in an organisation, productivity, attracting better people to the organisation, ultimately profitability. So that entrepreneurial way, creative way of thinking has many benefits for an organisation, so the messiness is worth it, really.
You work today with very senior people across a range of industries, including government, and so the reason for saying that is the context is different than if I'm a commercial organisation. What's the role of the managers and leaders and senior people that you work with in sort of this, or encouraging this? I mean, what is their role? How do you work with your clients on this sort of things?
Well, creativity lands itself in all sorts of different ways, but where I try to add value to their thinking is asking creative questions. So asking them really to think outside their normal way of doing things, have a self-awareness around what they do and how they could do it differently, and challenging them on ways of their decision-making processes. I think that's the key, is in what I do now, is driving that creative thinking, ensuring that they're not just doing things the way they used to do it because that's the way they know how to do it. So I think that challenging piece breeds creativity.
It was 64%, I think, was the number you threw up. Okay. So for the 64%, but even the other 36%, is this a muscle that can be developed, or is this kind of like innate, do you think?
No, I think it's absolutely a muscle that can be developed. I don't think necessarily, as the numbers show, that this way of thinking comes naturally to a lot of people. They're wedded onto the way they've done things, and it's probably worked in the past. But with everything changing in the world around us so quickly, we have to be, agile, adaptable, and creative thinking allows for that in an organisation, for leaders especially. So, the way to do this, the way to build this into an organisation really is first awareness and celebration of messiness. And then to have the right people, as I said before, in the room, allowing these conversations to flow. But organisations and leaders need to trust that they can facilitate this way of thinking. If you've got, and really embed that through an organisation, through teams, through individuals, that there is a culture that allows for this way of thinking. Otherwise, that's the fastest way to kill creativity, is to have distrust in the room, or have a situation where people can't speak out about new ways of thinking. But the organisations that are succeeding, in this turmoil of a world that we are in, are the ones that are able to adapt and pivot quickly to new ways of thinking. We've seen it so much through COVID. If you're still doing things the way you're doing it 2 years ago, you're in trouble. So we're seeing it in evidence all around us. But I think having a framework, as we're talking about today, where we celebrate both sides of the coin, allows leaders to think in a really different way, and to allow themselves to think and to challenge themselves and their teams to think more creatively.
It seems to me that, if the leader isn't naturally oriented like this may feel quite uncomfortable. And in fact, in a lot of organizations, in a lot of our careers, we work in environments where we're trying to create more control because it de-risks the organization and theoretically creates more predictability and repeatability and all that sort of stuff, and it's kind of an anathema to creativity and disruption, and you know what I mean?
And that's the point. The tightrope's really, really difficult to find. And each organisation needs to really sort of be able to define where they're comfortable, where getting uncomfortable becomes too risky, which is the definition of an entrepreneurial thinking. Risk takers, passionate, ideas driven, making things happen. So each organisation needs to find where that tightrope is, and always be assessing it, really, because with everything changing around organisations and people, you've always got to have your eye on at what point have we gone this too far or this far.
So we're back to a judgment, I guess, at that point.
Yeah.
The organisation, the leader, and what have you,
Yeah.
forming some sort of judgment on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there particular sort of micro skills that you think people need to be successful with this, or is it a mindset that we need, or is it the right tools, frameworks, if you will, to do this? I mean, are there any sort of hacks that you, but that you would sort of think about to encourage this?
Yeah, well, I think it's all of the above. I mean, I think it is a mindset. For many people, 64% of people, it's a different mindset. So yes, I think, well, it's an awareness piece, it's a mindset, it's being empowered to have a trusting culture where people can actually have this stuff bubble up. But from an organisational perspective, from a leadership perspective, I definitely think it's about testing the boundaries of your thinking, the way you've made decisions in the past, thinking outside the square, and celebrating that with teams. It really does come down to resilience as well, your ability to kind of be able to think this way and believe and trust in yourself, as well as the environment that you're in, because it's not easy. But the benefits are huge in terms of how it can add value to organisations.
Well, I was wondering about that. How do we actually quantify, or how can we measure the benefits of this? Are there obvious ways, or maybe they're not obvious? I don't know.
Well, I think the obvious way to measure commerciality is profitability. So where creative thinking comes into that is really around whether an organisation is adding value at the intersection of creativity and commercialism. Creativity builds well-being, it builds a brand that people want to work for, so it attracts good talent, it drives productivity, which ultimately drives profitability. So I think it is measurable, but I think different organisations will measure it in different ways depending on what their outcomes are.
With COVID and ways of working and more hybrid and more online. Have you noticed organizations getting more or less creative, if you will?
I think they've had to by necessity. Whether or not they're thinking in this framework is another thing. But I think we've all had to get incredibly creative about how we talk to our customers, build products and services, keep staff, all of those commercial issues that we're all facing. The creative thinking is what's coming up with new ideas. So yes, I think that is by osmosis happening. Whether or not leaders are thinking in this framework, I think probably not. So I think this framework allows leaders to kind of really get behind themselves in terms of celebrating both sides of the seas.
It sounds like it's kind of like seeing it as, and being deliberate maybe with doing this. As I'm listening to you sort of describe how organizations have coped during COVID, I'm thinking, yeah, there has been a lot of adaptability and flexibility and creativity and blah, 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 which is terrific. But we've just, through osmosis, we've just kind of done that. But yet, so it was deliberate, but sparked by, there was a catalyst for it. So in absence of the catalyst, maybe the framework, if you will, becomes the tool that you use as a way of sparking this in an ongoing way. Is that right?
Well, I think it is, because I think the risk that we run is that we go back to doing things the way we're doing it before. Here's a good example. So during COVID, international runway shows in the fashion industry came to an end. You couldn't travel and all sorts of hurdles. And the discussion during COVID was, isn't this great? There's not so much pressure on people travelling all over the world to go to the fashion shows in Italy or Rome or wherever, Paris. This is really reframing the way the industry works. Of course, 2.5 years down the track, the industry's reverted exactly back to where it was before COVID.
Okay.
So there's a great example where creative necessity drove the commercial outcomes, but everything sort of slipped back into the way it was. So I think organisations need to be really careful that they haven't got agile and adaptable by necessity through things like COVID, and then they just revert back to the way they were doing things before. So having this thinking at the forefront of leaders' minds keeps them on edge, and understanding that if they've changed their organisation for the better, they should continue to adapt that way.
It's this constant disruption. Okay, so we've talked about sort of, what it is, a way to think about it. We've talked about a framework. We've talked about the sort of environment that we're in. We've talked about how leaders and managers can encourage this. Are there other things that we should be thinking about as it relates to sort of creativity, or this tension between these two things as you've described, the creativity and the commercial outcomes, if you will?
Yeah, I think that creativity can manifest itself in so many ways. We've talked about, in the fashion industry, creativity is about design. It's about sketching and pattern making and fabrics. It's very visible.
Yeah.
But in the work that I'm doing now, coaching, it's actually in creative questions. So creativity manifests itself in so many different ways. But if a leader is adapting that way of thinking, they can apply it with teams. They can apply it, very importantly, with all stakeholders around the business. I mean, you need boards, and you need shareholders, and you need teams and clients to actually be thinking this way as well, for the extra added value that can drive. So I think creativity, for many people, is a bit of a scary word, because it is messy and disruptive, and gets people thinking in a different way. But I think if people and leaders can reframe that into a positive sense and celebrate it in an organisation in equal measure to commerciality, that's where we can really drive leadership and added value.
Okay. What are the sort of 3 big takeaways that you think that people should, listening to this and watching this, should take away from this conversation?
Well, I think what I just said is super important. Number one is that organisations and leaders celebrate and place an importance on
really
both.
Value this.
Really value creative thinking processes within an organisation, married with commerciality, and find where that tightrope is for them, for the organisation. Once that can be defined, and then there's an awareness around that, then we can start to talk about the benefits. So the benefits being, well-being of an organisation, but also the people involved, attracting talent, driving profitability and productivity. And then how to do it depends on the organisation, but really at the end of the day it's about mindset, it's about the way they approach problems, opportunities, with an understanding that it's messy and it doesn't always feel terribly in control, but ultimately if managed well, there's a better outcome.
Well, I think you're the real live example of, you know, marrying that tension between the creativity in a hyper competitive environment that you're in and achieving commercial outcomes and sort of being able to successfully straddle that, and now using some of those learnings and principles and ways of thinking that you've described even here today in whatever organizations, you know, we're in, to sort of help us to, you know, create environments where our organizations can succeed in ways that we may not have thought about before. So, Alex, I think that's illuminating. You've reframed the way I think about creativity now, so thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks, Chris.
Great.